The Douglas daughters were seen as a problematic mixture of their father and their mother by the encroaching Euro society. They had been brought up with a degree of freedom not granted to British women at the time. They had a degree of sociability that newcomers sometimes found off-putting or disturbing. And the language of the day asks us a whole bunch of questions about identity. Douglas's identity as a man of mixed descent was not public knowledge. Amelia's identity as a woman of fur trade marriage, a product of multiple and complex relationships, was known and was commented on. The daughter's identity was commented on as it's sort of, this is paraphrasing, it's amazing how well they clean up given their racial heritage. There were constant, quiet insinuations that the girls were just not quite ladies, although they had had good education. And they married well within the context of Victoria's society. Cecilia Douglas, the oldest daughter, married the HBC doctor, John Sebastian Helmgen, who then entered politics. Jane Douglas married Alexander Grant Dallas, who went on to be governor of Rupert's Land. Agnes married Arthur Thomas Bushby, who became a government official in New Westminster. Alice was the family rebel. She ran away with her father's secretary, Charles Good, and apparently by some, caused a real scandal, because then it was unclear whether they got married and ran away, or ran away and got married, or ran away and were forced into getting married with a second rather public marriage in Victoria to show family approval. The marriage didn't last. She caused further scandal when they were divorced, and she remarried in a second time in San Francisco. Douglas's only surviving son had a much harder time. The accounts say he was sickly. His father was disappointed with him. He didn't work as hard. He hadn't had the hard discipline of fur trade life. And he had a much harder time. He couldn't really marry up, and he couldn't marry out. And his identity as a child of a mixed relationship was far more problematic for colonial society in Victoria, certainly. He married, moved to San Francisco, and died young. The family home became the center of Douglas's life in retirement, with one notable trip to Europe, to Scotland, England, and the continent, where he regained connections with his Scottish Douglas relatives. In old age, some of the contentiousness of his governorship mellowed, as it frequently does. And by the time of his death in 1877, he was seen as the grand old man of the colony. That's the funeral cortege going from, that is still there, the Church of Our Lord in Victoria, just near the Provincial Museum, winding its way up to the Anglican Cathedral, Christ Church, which is still there at the top of the hill. After Douglas's death, his youngest daughter, Martha, married, and the occasion was a photo op for the family. In her widowhood, Amelia was photographed occasionally, apparently didn't make very many public appearances, but nurtured and supported her family. She died in 1890. So what does the Douglas story tell us? One thing I would argue is BC, British Columbia, was never a white settler society. It was always far more complex than that. There were multiple identities. There were multiple and conflicting identities. Douglas, as governor, was governor, but he was also a man who had been brought up in a slave society, been shipped off to Scotland to be educated as the illegitimate son of a prominent business family whose other family knew him, acknowledged him, but never really embraced him. Amelia's mother was turned off by her father as the not wanted Aboriginal wife, ended up spending the rest of her life being taken care of by the Grey Sisters in the Red River Colony. Amelia's sister, Marguerite, entered the Grey Nuns and became their first Métis sister. Her brother, after their parents' death, launched a court case against the other family over inheritance, saying we were legitimate children. Douglas and Amelia in Victoria were seen as establishment who were always a little on both at the center and slightly at the edge. The daughters married up and out, the son got stuck. The changing world from a fur trade world to a colonial settlement world to this complex world meant that they were always people in between in the mud. If I was going to make a kind of concluding comment, I think it's a great metaphor for British Columbia today in one sense. It's not an unproblematic one. I don't mean to gloss it over and make it romantic, but at the same time, Douglas innovates in interesting ways, and their lives are a kind of metaphor for the complexities of living in a complex world. Thank you.
Five minutes for questions?
I'd be happy to answer questions if there are any. I've stunned everyone into submission. Yeah.
All right, well, I'll ask a question. I'm Tad McElraith from the Department of Anthropology, and I'm interested in what is sometimes perceived of as Douglas's mixed legacy around Aboriginal rights. That this is a man who acknowledged Aboriginal rights to the point where he decided treaties needed to be negotiated, that there was something to actually negotiate, that it wasn't about just taking land from Native people. He settled treaties. He did 14 of them. But in 1854, he stopped, and he didn't negotiate anymore after that. And so my question is, what does this sort of greater context of his life and his experience in the changing times in the 1850s and 1860s perhaps say to us about his motivations and his legacy around Aboriginal rights?
In part, the treaties were his initiative. He was using the precedent set from New Zealand. He was using the precedent set from Washington State. Howard Foster, who's looked at the treaties, says they are a mixture of language taken from British colonial settings, most notably the Treaty of Waitangi, and American models mashed together. He negotiates the treaties and then lets the colonial office in London know what he's done. He behaves entirely in a way that says it's being asked sort of for permission or for forgiveness and permission. Right. Yeah. It also represents the length of time that the correspondence takes to move between here and there. He's clearly establishing the idea, based back into 1763 in the Royal Proclamation, that Indigenous peoples' lands can't be taken away. They have to be negotiated by the Crown. Are they good deals for Indigenous peoples in there? No. Are they the only treaties that get signed? Yes. He's clearly got a model in mind that isn't just about a resource grab. What happens after the mid-1850s, if the gold rush hadn't happened, would there have been further treaties? If there hadn't been that mass influx that changed British Columbia society, British Columbia of 1858 is completely different than the British Columbia of, say, 1863. Late, just before his retirement, he tries to start another round of treaty making, and his intention is to do further negotiations. It doesn't go anywhere.
His constituency changes, in a
His
sense.
constituency changes, and the pressures on him to create settler space, which I think he resists to some extent, become increasingly hard to ignore. There are more people around. In 1850s, he's it. He's the author. He's the CEO, he's the CFO, he's the every other kind of the top of the org chart. And there's nobody to say no to him, or nobody who can say no to him. By the mid-1860s, there's the Royal Engineers, there's Begbie, there's the church, there's an influx of settlers, there's a whole different set of pressures. It's speculative history, would it have ended up differently? I think his intentions are somewhat mixed because first and foremost, he's always thinking about profitability for the company. That's who he is. Everything else happens on top of it. Government happens on top of his primary understanding of the world, which was shaped as an 18 or 19-year-old, I think, at Yale La Crosse, where he figures out how the world works. I don't know if that answers the question.
Gives
But-
more things to think about.
They're the only treaties that get signed.
Well, that's remarkable. I mean,
Until the Niska
Right.
treaty
Well,
is negotiated, with the exception of the peace
Treaty
bloc.
8, but, yeah.
We have time for about one more question,
Yep.
then.
Do they have any ancestors alive this day?
There are some, Cecilia and John Sebastian Pilgrim's children survived into adulthood and they had children. Most of the other family either didn't have children or the family shrunk. And what's also interesting is by the third generation, they're erasing their Indigenous identity. So the knowledge of Amelia as an Indigenous woman is retained in the family, but Martha, the youngest, who writes down some of her mother's stories, was told by her father, don't tell anybody where you heard these stories. Don't tell them that they were family stories because that's no longer acceptable in this changing world. So it's a complex story.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. James, and Mr.